It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Iain. I met Iain, in fact, last November, and was enormously impressed by his scholarship, by his erudition. In fact, I would say that were he not such a nice person, that he's actually put in the world to make the rest of us feel inadequate. He has had, and you will have picked up the details, I hope, from the programme, but he's had two brilliant careers. Imagine starting off as a lecturer in English, obviously taking a degree first, and then going on to be elected on 3 occasions as a Fellow of All Souls College. I mean, to be elected once is about the greatest accolade that a scholar can receive.
David.
But to be elected 3 times is absolutely extraordinary. But not content with those honours and riches and successes, Iain then decided, mainly I think because of his great interest in the brain and in thinking and in the mind, that he wanted to go on to qualify as a medical doctor. So he did. And then to qualify as a psychiatrist. And again, you'll have seen from the programme that he had a distinguished career as a psychiatrist in the National Health Service. And he is now in private practice in London, but lives on the Isle of Skye whenever he can get away from London. And his plans, I know, are to retire there before very long, where he will write and think and provide the world with greater riches. Those of you who've been fortunate enough, as yet, I hope that all of us will be in due course, to buy and read his book, will find it an absolute mine of information, and beautifully written and extraordinarily comprehensible even to the layman. Iain, we're all looking forward enormously to your talk. I'll get out of your way and let you get started.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Am I live? Yes. Well, thank you very much, David. I feel that after that, everything is going to be a complete anticlimax, but there we are. For those of you who want to know more about my book, if you Google my name, it will take you straight to my website where you can download the first chapter and have a little think about whether you want to purchase it. And the bibliography is also online. So thank you very much for that introduction and for asking me to come and talk to you today. It's a bit of a daunting task to try to go through this book, so I'm not going to do that. What I thought I would do, and might be a bit helpful, was to give you some idea of why I wrote it and some of the ideas in it, and then we can sort of talk about things together. The first thing I'd like to say about the book, because I didn't realise how it could be misunderstood, is that it's really, essentially, without sounding too pompous, it's a philosophical book. It's a book, in fact, of ontology. What I'm really talking about is the nature of whatever there is. And that, I hope that will become clearer in the course of what I have to say. But the ideas started to form with me many, many years ago, probably about 30 years ago, when I was a lecturer in English at Oxford. And I wrote a book, in fact, called Against Criticism, which was about what is wrong with the whole academic process of literary criticism. Because it seemed to me that there was a problem in the way that we were being asked to look at works of art. We mined them for ideas, and we took all sorts of things out of them and looked at them in the abstract, and somehow the whole thing was completely diminished, and indeed the whole reason that one went to this thing in the first place seemed to be lost, which was something to do with its uniqueness and something to do with the fact that it was actually not a set of disembodied ideas, but a physical entity, very obvious in the case of a painting, probably fairly obvious in the case of music, less obvious perhaps in the case of a poem, but it is. It works on us physiologically, it works on us as an embodied thing that can only be expressed best in the words that are there. When you try to paraphrase it, you're left with a handful of dust. So I wrote this book, and I was wondering what it was that that was going wrong, and it seemed to me to have to do with a number of different factors. Something that was unique, embodied, deeply metaphorical, deeply ambiguous, that was where its richness lay, was turned into something more precise, more abstract, more theoretical, more general. And I found that the language in which I was trying to explain this didn't really exist, that my language kept bringing me back to a certain way of thinking about things. And I was lucky enough, because that's the nature of All Souls, to be sitting next to, one time at dinner, a colleague, a great sinologist, alas now dead, called David Hawkes. And I was trying to explain to him this, and he said, oh, well, the Chinese would have no difficulty in understanding exactly what you're talking about. So that piqued my interest, and he directed me to some reading in Oriental literature. What I felt was, at heart, the problem was something to do with the mind-body problem, as philosophers call it, or used to call it. And I read philosophers and studied psychology with a hope that I could get closer to this, and in some ways I did, but I also felt that what I was doing was in itself very disembodied and very abstract. And so it struck me that the most interesting thing on this topic was actually Oliver Sacks, who in those days had just published his magnum opus, Awakenings. And for those of you who, I believe there is a film, but if you've seen the film, I can't imagine how that could possibly give you an idea of the strength of this book, which it took him 13 years to write, and which is full of every kind of interest, really, I think, far outstripping all the other pieces of, I think all the rest of his writing is relatively superficial by comparison. Anyway, in that I saw that he took case histories in great detail and looked at what happened to somebody's body when things went wrong with their mind, and what happened to their minds when things went wrong with their bodies. And I thought, yes, rather than sit disembodiedly pondering this problem, I should go and train in medicine, which I did. And indeed, I remember going during my medical student days to the Maudsley, where I was very kindly entertained by Peter Fenwick. Peter may not remember this, but he took me on a ward round at Mapother House, and I was very enthused by what I saw and what I heard, and intrigued by it. And Alwyn Lishman, who rather became my mentor, the great sort of founder, and really, of the concept of sort of organic psychiatry in the English-speaking world, he and Peter were enormously formative influences on me during that period. Then I went actually to the Maudsley. I was lucky enough to go there and train, and eventually was a consultant there. And during my training, I just happened to go and hear a man called John Cutting, who was one of the lecturers at the Maudsley, and I still think one of the most interesting and subtle minds in psychiatry in the English-speaking world. And he had just completed a marvellous book called The Right Cerebral Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders. And he was giving some talks based on it. And I really couldn't believe my ears, because I had been told in medical school that we knew lots about what the left hemisphere did. It was this important thing that did reason, and it did language and so forth. But John was saying, no, actually, the right hemisphere plays a part in these things too, but it just also understands a lot of other things. It's the bit of the brain with which we understand metaphor. And having been a literary scholar of a kind, I was intrigued by that, because I thought a lot about metaphor and realized that metaphor is by no means a sort of interesting literary decoration as it was thought of during the Enlightenment, but is in fact, as a number of good philosophers have recently been expounding, the basis of all our thought, including and perhaps especially, obviously, in the case of our thinking about science and in philosophy. So that was very interesting. And he also was saying it is the part of the brain that's able to hold things that are not yet made precise, so that things that are apparently conflicting can be held in resolution together. It's the part of the brain with which we empathize most with people, It's the bit that has sense of humour, that understands implicit and indirect meaning. All this seemed to me fantastically rich, but of course it was also exactly what I was trying to say earlier in my literary career about what went wrong when one started to inspect a work of art. Then I was lucky enough to go off to the United States, sorry, enough about me in a minute, but, to Johns Hopkins on a research fellowship for a short period, and where I got involved in neuroimaging. And the neuroimaging was indeed very interesting, because I was in fact looking at the asymmetry in the brains of people with schizophrenia, and did some early work on the delineation of an area of the brain called the inferior parietal lobule, which is very important in the right hemisphere. But that really isn't what struck me. What struck me was what might strike anybody when they go to America, which was the extraordinary explicitness that suddenly covered the surface of life. And I found that the things that I was saying were not understood at all by my interlocutors, because I imagined that all the implicit meanings, which were sometimes contrary to the expressed meanings, were being picked up, but they weren't at all. And it wasn't just a sort of language problem of that kind. I noticed that everywhere in society there were an awful lot of regulations and rules. Now, that was 1992, and now you might think, well, that's the same here, but it wasn't. We've forgotten. But in the last 20 years, there's been an enormous explosion in this country of tiny regulations and algorithms and guidelines and rules and formulas for just about bloody everything. But in those days, I was astonished to find that on the campus at the university, Johns Hopkins, there was a little guidebook which was issued to undergraduates to tell them how to relate to the opposite sex, how to date somebody. And I really thought, well, when we actually have to have rules and laws about how it's done, I understand where this drive came from. It comes from a perfectly understandable position, which is in itself honourable. But if the business of the very delicate and subtle and ambivalent business of the relationship between the sexes is reduced to something explicit, the game's up as far as I'm concerned. So that was that. And I then, while I was there, John sent me a very excited letter, because we didn't have email in those days, saying, I've just read a fantastic book by a man called Louis Sass, who is not Thomas Zaz, the rather irritating sort of gung-ho anti-psychiatry man of the 1970s, but in fact a professor of psychology at Rutgers, who had written a wonderful book called Madness and Modernism, which again, if you don't know it, I've totally recommend to you. The thesis of which was that when one came to look at the literature, art and thought of modernism, it bore extraordinary resemblances to the phenomenology of schizophrenia. In other words, when you looked at the sort of things schizophrenics say about their world, about their experience, about the structure of the world, even looking at their paintings and so on, they bear remarkable resemblances to the phenomena of modernism. I might have a bit more to say about that later. But what struck me there was that this world that they described, that he described as being so characteristic of schizophrenia, one in which connection with the world was lost, in which empathy was absent, and instead a rather cold remoteness obtained. The world seemed to be a heap of fragments that were no longer united or made any sense. Implicit and metaphorical meaning were taken literally by schizophrenics. Their world was peculiarly at the same time over-abstract and over-concrete. The sort of toing and froing area in the middle, the area of metaphor, seemed to have been lost. So that was a very rich set of thoughts for me, because it made me think, is there something that's going on in modern society that I was noticing in America, because after all America is the future for all of us, is that something to do with an increasing dominance of the left hemisphere? And I started to look at the literature on that. And I suppose one of the things that struck me most was that in John Cutting's writings, all the phenomena of schizophrenia were absences of things that were given by the right hemisphere, coupled with rather extreme things that the left hemisphere gave. He and Louis Sass compellingly show that schizophrenia is not an absence of a reason. Well, it is an absence of reason, but it's an excess of rationality. It's an over-rational way of looking, and an over-conscious, a hyper-conscious way of looking at things that ought to be intuitive. So, all of this fueled a desire in me to learn more about the differences between the hemispheres. And essentially, I've spent the last 18 to 20 years trying to find as much information as I could from an exploding literature about differences between hemispheres. Now, when I say that literature, it's often hidden. It's not that people anymore write papers about the differences between the hemispheres, but if you actually look at their paper about something completely different and just happen to look at what comes out of it about the right and left hemispheres, incidentally, there's a mine of information there which is entirely consistent. And I realise that to talk about the hemispheres is to stick your head on the block, really. It is, at least among my scientific and psychiatric colleagues. That's one of the reasons that nobody writes papers about it anymore, because they're worried about being identified with a very simplistic and rather unhelpful dichotomy which flourished in the 60s and 70s following the first split brain operations by Sperry and Bogan in the United States, in which psychologists and philosophers became very interested in the separation of the hemispheres. And there came about this rather naive idea that somehow the right hemisphere was sort of pink and fluffy and sort of did nice sort of creative and emotional things, and the left hemisphere was sort of hard-nosed and logical but basically got it right. And that, of course, is absolutely not right, and I think everybody knows that. And so people had sort of shied away from the topic, because piece after piece of information suggested that actually both hemispheres are involved in everything. So both hemispheres are critical for language. Both hemispheres are critical for reason. Both hemispheres are involved in creativity. Both hemispheres have emotion. So isn't that story dead? Well, I happen to think not at all, because it's not what the two hemispheres do that matters. We keep thinking of it like a machine. It's how they do it and the way in which they approach it, which is entirely different. And I started thinking about the structure of the brain in itself, and I'm going to just put up some slides. Thank you very much to Chris, if he's here, for the loan of the the lead that enabled me to download. When I got into my laptop, I found I hadn't got the talk anyway, but I actually got some slides, so you'll have to make do with the odd slide. Now that actually shows for those who are not familiar with the corpus callosum, the structure of the brain from above. That's the front at the top and the back at the bottom, and the right hemisphere is pulled aside to show this band of billions of fibres that connect the two hemispheres at the base. Now, one of the sort of basic questions which I felt nobody had satisfactorily answered, or perhaps even asked, was why on earth is the brain divided in two if it's all about making connections, and if, as we're constantly told, consciousness arises in some mysterious fashion as yet to be explained out of the multiple interconnections of neurons? How come this mass is almost entirely divided, just with this connecting sort of band at the bottom? Even more curious, as the brain has evolved, the ratio of the size of the corpus callosum to the rest has got smaller, so the connectivity has somehow become even less important. The plot really thickens when you discover that the principal function of these fibres is to inhibit. It does convey information, but a lot of the purpose of conveying the information is to stop the other hemisphere from becoming involved. So it seems that evolution has left us with two distinct chunks of neural tissue for some rather important reason, because over the course of evolution they could have become combined. Indeed, they could have been combined from the word go. And I put this up not to put as many of the audience off as possible. But this tadpole-like looking thing is in fact the neural tube of a fetus at 33 days. And what it shows is the beginnings of the brain, the spinal cord. Oh, there is a little pointer here, isn't there? That's natty. Yes. So those things, that's going to become the medulla oblongata. This is going to be the midbrain here, and these are going to be the cerebellar hemispheres, and this is the what's going to turn into the cerebral cortex. And what I'm really showing is that if you wanted a bit more space, you could do it like this, or like this. You could just push out the sides, and it would be a single volume. But in fact, no, they've budded out as two little sort of ears that will then come up separately. So even from the word go, even in embryology, the thing is set out to be divided. It's not just an expansion. Now, there seems to be something very odd going on here, and I thought about it and realized that while it might be interesting that our brains do different things because of these, this split between the hemispheres exists in lower animals. In fact, it exists in reptiles and birds, and so on. So there must be something quite important here that goes all the way down the phylogenetic tree. And I asked myself, well, what is that? And went to the literature on a very interesting and expanding literature on birds and animals and what their two hemispheres do. And in a nutshell, it seems that the point of having two hemispheres is to be able to pay a different kind of attention to the world. And to try and encapsulate this simply, one needs to think of a chicken trying to pick up a piece of seed off the bed of grit and gravel on which it lies. For that, it needs a very precise focus to be able to bring into clear resolution a very small entity. But if that's all it did, it would be dead, because meanwhile it would be being eaten. So it solves the problem of how to stay alive and eat by having the other hemisphere take the broadest possible open attention for whatever might be, without preconception as to what it might be. It might be friend or foe, but it might be a predator. And so, as it turns out, there is robust evidence that in birds, their right eye, which leads to the left hemisphere, because there's total decussation, unlike in humans, the right eye does equate in birds to the left hemisphere, because their eyes, of course, are around the sides of their head. So the right eye, the left hemisphere, is focused on what the hen needs. And the same is true of predatory animals. It's focused on grasp or chase, locking onto an object that is already of interest and specifying that and going for it. Whereas the left eye, which is for them connected to the right hemisphere, keeps a broad, uncommitted, open attention, and is the side of the brain with which they both look out, as I say, for danger, but also relate to their conspecifics. And so birds and animals tend preferentially to approach a mate with the left eye and will turn their heads to look at a predator with the right eye, with the left eye, so that they can use their right hemisphere to see it. So that is interesting. And it turns out that animals and birds that are not properly lateralized are actually at a disadvantage. They can't carry out their roles as satisfactorily. So when we need to get on to humans, really, and when one comes to look at humans, one finds again the most basic, I suppose, difference is this business of attention. And neurologists divide attention up in various ways. But effectively, there is a dichotomy between a sustained, broad vigilance and a briefly applied, focused attention. And there's a massive evidence from lesion studies, from neuropsychological studies in intact human beings, and from imaging, that the right hemisphere, again, keeps an open sort of attention to the world, an uncommitted but also connected attention, if you remember about making the bond with the mate there. And the left hemisphere, a detailed, focused attention, which is dedicated to a task in hand. And in hand is a good phrase there, because the left hemisphere also controls, for most of us, the grasping hand with which we seize on what we need. And to begin with, attention might sound like a rather dull concept, something it's quite hard to get excited about, and it's often treated as though it were just another function in psychology, alongside, memory and calculation and reason and so on. But it isn't, of course, it isn't. Philosophically speaking, attention is something completely different. Attention changes the world. Attention is something that a machine couldn't do. It can do most of the other things. It can be made to do the other things. You can't attend. You need consciousness to attend. And if, as I believe, the world is not a given out there in the way that scientific materialism says it is, a sort of naive realist position, but nor is it just a fantasy or efflorescence of our minds, a sort of naive idealism of the kind that one finds in postmodernism, in which the world is just our own creation, but is in fact something that comes into being through what I call a reverberative interaction between the thing out there and ourselves, each modifying the other. Then the mode of attention that we pay to the world is going to be very important. It's governed, of course, by the nature of the object that we think we're looking at, but what we think we're looking at is also governed by attention, another circular relationship. Because if you pay a certain kind of attention to the world, it will seem very different from how it will seem if you pay another kind of attention. A couple of obvious examples are the sexual act, which, if thought about in an objective way and measured in a laboratory, seems very different from the thing that can have the deepest sort of spiritual meaning. And religious experiences are the same, that they have an interiority which can't be conveyed from the exterior, and if one simply inspects them objectively, a ritual or a group or a set of ideas or beliefs, they have a different meaning from the one they have if they're attended to from a position of commitment. So the tension is not at all a minor concept. It is in fact the basis of being. Because, as I say, literally we bring things into being for us through our attending to them. We are, in that sense, partners in creation, a very exciting idea. How we think about the world matters because it makes a difference to what the world becomes, and what the world becomes makes a difference to who we are in turn. So, from this different kind of attention, there comes a whole range of things that one could divide up and look at, and in my book I do, because the neuropsychological literature does that, thinks of them as different areas of experience, but which are in themselves entirely coherent. And I can only allude very briefly to some, and some of them will be no surprise. The left hemisphere tends, because it is more detached and because it sees things in parts, to see a structure as made up of bits and mechanically composed of parts, where the right hemisphere is aware that there is a whole that pre-exists our attempt to make it from the parts. Now, most people will be familiar in this audience with this picture. Out of interest, how many people here have not seen this picture before? Oh, quite a few, that's good. Can everyone see what it shows? Anybody mystified? Yeah. It's a Dalmatian dog, and here is its nose, and here is its ear hanging down, and there is its back and tail and hind leg and other hind leg, and it's sniffing at an object on a crossway of paths in the shade of a tree. Now, the interesting thing about that, which shows so-called Gestalt perception, we see what it is as a whole, is there's actually no way you could build that up from the parts. There's absolutely no way you could go to this bit here and go, oh yes, that must be a bit of a Dalmatian, I would think. And this thing here, a bit of a tree, I suppose. You can't do it. There is no starting point for building that. You have to see it as a whole. And in fact, that's not strange, because most of our perception is like this. We go straight to what something is. And so the right hemisphere tends to see things as a whole, the left as parts. The right hemisphere tends to see things in context, because it sees things as a whole. And the context is a very important thing. It was what was the problem, partly, with the decomposing activity of the English faculty that I belong to, was that as soon as you took things out of the context of the poem that they were in, or the work of art that they were in, or indeed out of the context perhaps even of the person who wrote them, they were rather different things. And so that was, the context thing was really a very significant point. And the philosopher Dewey has said that, one of the biggest failings in philosophy, he's said it many times, is the taking of things out of context, the ignoring of context, which utterly alters what there is in the way that the whole alters the parts. So, and which is why, of course, you can't build up a whole from the parts, because in order to understand the parts, you first have to know what kind of a whole they belong to, rather as here. So, it decontextualizes. It makes things more abstract. It takes things out of their context, and therefore they become abstracted. It's less in touch with the emotions and the body. It does have emotions. It is, of course, connected literally, physiologically, to the rest of the body. But in fact, the richest and deepest connections with the limbic system and the hypothalamic axis are from the right hemisphere. Altogether, it produces, if I can put it so simply, a disembodied, fragmented, abstracted world made up of little pieces that are static and known, certain. And that, of course, is very reassuring, because there's a part of our brain that hungers for certainty. We must have this fact definite before we can move on to the next. It's as though one couldn't go on to look at this picture, until one had decided that this definitely was the nose of a dog. And that, of course, would get one nowhere at all. The right hemisphere's vision, by contrast, is of a seamlessly connected world in which there are unique things, because one of the things that's lost in the left hemisphere vision is uniqueness. Only the right hemisphere seems to be able to appreciate the uniqueness. People who had right hemisphere strokes suddenly are not able to recognize a farmer who had a right hemisphere stroke was unable to he could tell that he'd got cows, and in even roughly speaking which were Friesians and which were Jerseys, but he couldn't tell that which cow was which anymore. And people have difficulty recognizing individuals. This is partly, of course, because the right hemisphere is the hemisphere with which we understand faces by and large. And there's a condition which some people here will know about called prosopagnosia, which is a consequence of a certain kind of right hemisphere stroke, in which one can no longer recognize an individual or read a face. It is the hemisphere which has this sort of seamlessly interconnected, constantly moving, but therefore never certain vision of the world, in which opposites can come together, but are not sort of at either end of a linear stretch as they are for the left hemisphere. Now, it may sound, in giving that sort of summary really, and there's a lot more to say, because in fact there are differences in the way they see music and time and the body as a whole and all sorts of things, which perhaps we can come back to, but or perhaps you'd like to read about. But those are sort of probably the broad outlines of the differences. There has been concerns about the different kinds of emotions expressed by the hemispheres. I suppose I should say something about that. And there has been this idea that the right hemisphere has negative emotion and the left hemisphere positive emotion, by which it means that the left hemisphere seems to have a sort of more upbeat sort of take on things than the right hemisphere. But it's interesting that our language gives us these very loaded terms, negative and positive. For me, there's nothing negative about sorrow. In fact, without it, we would be less than human. And it's interesting that, in fact, the left hemisphere's self-appreciation is unrealistically positive. So the right hemisphere's one is much closer to what other people think about if you do a self-evaluation using your right or left hemisphere, which can be temporally inactivated experimentally. The right hemisphere will have a slightly sadder but more realistic estimation than that of the left, a point that perhaps we will again need to come back to. So there are differences there, but what I think that's an inadequate way of looking at it. I haven't got time to go into the detail, but I think what comes out of the literature is that emotions that involve connection, this is sometimes referred to as approach versus avoidance, but I don't think that's what it's about. It's about a sense of empathic connection are in the right hemisphere. And if you are empathically connected to other people, you will experience more sadness. And indeed, in children, sadness and a capacity for empathy are very closely related. Children that have very little capacity for sadness also have very little capacity for empathy. So I think it's more about those emotions, and the emotions of triumph and competition are in the left hemisphere. Preferentially. In fact, one of the absolutely robust findings is that anger, probably the only emotion that sort of sorts pretty neatly to one hemisphere, is anger is a left hemisphere mediated emotion. But it might sound from all that I'm saying here as though I'm banging on some drum about how wonderful the right hemisphere is and we shouldn't have a left hemisphere somehow. We would all be better off if the population had a sort of left hemisphere stroke. But I don't actually believe that for a minute. There is a chap called Tony Wright who's written a book called Left in the Dark, the thesis of which is that basically there's something retarded about the left hemisphere. I don't think that's the problem. And the way I look at it is in the metaphor of the title of this book, which is The Master and His Emissary, which comes very loosely from a little fragment in Nietzsche, where he talks about a wise spiritual master who looked after a small community, and because of his wisdom in governing it, it flourished and expanded. And there came a point when he realized that he couldn't actually deal with all the concerns of this community himself. Not only that he didn't have the capacity to do so, but importantly that he must not get involved with them, otherwise he couldn't maintain the view of the world that he had. The two things were necessary but not mutually compatible. And so he trusted his best advisor and sent him as his emissary to do his work. And this emissary effectively felt that he was the one that was doing all the hard work, doing all the heavy lifting, was the bright guy, while the master just sat at home and contemplated. And that really he was the master, and his master was an irrelevance. And so he donned the master's cloak, and as a result the whole domain fell into ruins. And that seemed to me to have an extraordinary resonance for the relationship between the hemispheres, because in the first part of the book, having gone through the neuropsychological literature, and I've looked at about 2,500 papers which are all referenced in there, to try and tease out what there is that is known about the differences. I then look at the philosophical implications of these and come to the conclusion that we need both hemispheres, but that one of them founds and grounds the other, and also needs to take up again the knowledge of the other. And this is the right hemisphere. It is the hemisphere with which our first perception of something comes about, and it's also the one with which our overall take on something is drawn together. But in the meantime, it's enormously enriched by the work that the left hemisphere does. So it's exactly like an emissary who goes out, does some work, and reports back. And this is true, perhaps I could give one simple example of language, because it's quite relevant, really. There's a chap called David McNeill who's done some wonderful, painstaking studies over many, many decades, looking at gesture. That is his field of interest. He's in Chicago, I think. And he has videotaped people talking and looked at their gestures and what they say. And what has come out of this, if you subtly analyze it, is that the thought first comes in a Gestalt in a Gestalt form from the right hemisphere, and then appears to be passed to the left hemisphere for precision processing and expression. But the right hemisphere is the one we know from study of people with brain injuries, which also reintegrates the meaning of a sentence. So the syntax and a lot of the vocabulary, not all by any means, are in the left hemisphere, but the overall meaning of a sentence is in the right hemisphere. So, for example, if I say, it's a little bit hot in here today, you know that what I mean is, could we open that door, please? Whereas the left hemisphere thinks I'm supplying helpful meteorological information. So it's a different sort of way of thinking, really. And in fact, I got thinking very much about the relationship between language and thought, and I asked myself exactly why we have language. That's an interesting question in itself. And it's always been said that we can't think without language. But in fact, as I hope I show in the book, there's masses of evidence that our thoughts precede language. That people who have no words for things can still have the concept of them very easily and understand them. Children can understand things before they have the language for them. And indeed, people who have lost the faculty of speech can carry on thinking perfectly well. And so that doesn't seem to be the case. It's also said that it's for communication, but that doesn't seem to be the case either. Animals can certainly communicate in a primitive way without language, but in fact it's thought that the majority of everything we communicate as human beings is done non-verbally anyway, and having a telephone call about anything that really matters, like trying to conduct therapy over the telephone or trying to conduct a love relationship over the telephone, will tell any of you that all the important stuff gets missed. And so it's not really about it's about certain aspects of communication, of course, since we've got it, and it's about certain aspects of thinking, since we've got it, but it's about the precision-making and pinning of something down and putting a label on it. Now, that is actually terribly helpful, so we need that. As I say, we need our valuable emissary to go and clarify some things. But when that's done, it needs to be taken back into the right hemisphere, in which intonation and metaphor and subtlety and indirect meaning and humour and personality and all the other things are conveyed. So that just gives you an idea of it. But, of course, the language question is interesting, because when I was at medical school, people said, not only is the left hemisphere top hemisphere, so to speak, because it does all these clever things, but it's got a bigger volume here, really. You can see, over here on the right. This is big. Let me just orientate you to this picture before I go any further. This is the back of the brain, and that's the front, and we're looking at it from underneath, right? We're looking upwards. You're in your spinal cord looking up at your brain. And so the right is on the left and the left is on the right, just to make it easy for you. And this bit, this bit here is sort of language, well, the speech areas are towards the front here, but the receptive area in which we sort of understand language is back here in this expanded area I should be looking at the left hemisphere, which is greater, I'm getting confused now. This is the left hemisphere, and the speech areas are here, and the receptive language areas are back here. And it's always said that this bit got bigger because it needed space to accommodate this phenomenal thing of language, which is indeed a phenomenal thing. The most talkative chimpanzee that's ever been trained had a vocabulary of 130 words, but you and I probably have a vocabulary of about 70,000 words. So it is a huge leap, and that's where it's all going on. And that's what that's for, that bump. It's because of language. But that can't actually be right for three reasons. The first is that the orangutans and gorillas and so on, who can't speak, as I've just said, have this bump as well. And pre-linguistic man, as we can tell from the skulls, looking at the skulls, also had it. And it can't also be the full explanation of what's going on here, because in fact, although this bit was proudly pointed out to me, nobody mentioned that in fact the biggest expansion in the entire brain is in the right hemisphere, at the frontal pole. This is in fact the biggest side-to-side difference in the entire brain. And what is that about? And that actually begins to be evident in the higher apes as well. Now, what that part of the brain is principally, well, not principally because it does about 100,000 things, but I mean, one of the most important things that it does is that it mediates empathy and enables us to understand implicit meaning and to understand sense of humour and to have a relationship with others. And so something is going on here. It looks like the brain has been given a sort of twist. As you can see, that's what these arrows are about. This is something called Yakovlevian talk, after the chap Yakovlev who first described it. And it's as though the brain has been sort of twisted. And it confirms that something different must be going on in that nature must have designed these things differently. Because if it just wanted a bit more space, it would have done it symmetrically. The skull is a symmetrical structure. Why would it have expanded only locally in these areas? It's surely because they are doing very special things differently on the left and differently on the right. And perhaps it's worth just showing you this. This is just really to orient. It's a very, very Mickey Mouse picture of the brain. But basically, what it's showing you is the frontal lobes here, occipital here, temporal lobe here. Occipital lobe here, parietal lobe here, and what I just want you to note here is that is the central sulcus, which separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And it shows you just quite how big the frontal lobes are. And most people are a bit surprised by that because they think of it as being a bit of mush behind their forehead. But it's actually kind of like it looks like half the brain. It is in fact 35% of the brain. And that is an enormous expansion, because even a rather clever animal like a dog, only 7% of the cortex is frontal. But funnily enough, the higher apes have very similar frontal capacity. The difference in ours is that we have more white matter in ours, which is interesting itself, but I mustn't get distracted. So that anyway shows how big the frontal lobes are. Now, what do the frontal lobes do? They inhibit. This is an interesting concept, really. What seems to be going on in the brain is that one thing is inhibiting another and something is coming about. The right hemisphere tells the left hemisphere, keep out of this, because otherwise something won't happen. The left hemisphere tells the right hemisphere, similarly, keep out of this, otherwise something won't be able to happen. And what the frontal lobes are almost entirely devoted to is inhibiting the posterior cortex. That might sound not like a very great step forward in creativity, but in fact, paradoxically, through this negation of something very important stands forward. It enables us to stand back a bit from the world so that our immediate instincts are not the things that drive us to do whatever it is. We can plan something, we can see what another person might be thinking, we can step aside from the situation and see it in a broader context. And that's always said by neuroscientists nowadays to be the root of our Machiavellian intelligence. Machiavellian intelligence. Because, of course, basically we're wicked, we're selfish, we're horrible creatures. And the whole of nature is like this and was designed to be like this. But I say, well, yes, the left frontal cortex does enable us to scheme and plan in this way. But the right frontal cortex does something extremely important, which seems like the summit of this whole process of evolution, which is to enable us to connect. And so I say, yes, if the left hemisphere is Machiavelli, the right is Erasmus. It's the world in which there is humour and gentleness and tolerance and acceptance and a broad perspective. So it enables us, and that might sound a bit facetious, but it isn't at all. It's actually only when we stand back from the world a little bit and have what I call necessary distance that you can actually see the other person as an individual like yourself. If you're too far away, then you're estranged. If you're too close, you don't see it at all. It's like reading a book. If it's here, you can't read it. If it's there, you can't read it. There is a proper distance. And there is a proper distance for us from the world, which enables things to happen. So for the human being, the evolution of the frontal cortex brought about this distance from the world, and suddenly lots of things become apparent which weren't apparent before. And I see this division of the brain, which has a meaning, as I say, in attention all the way up the tree to the human being, as founding two whole different kinds of world for us. And the word I want you to remember here is representation. Because, as I say, the thing in its precognitive state, what Heidegger calls presences to us first, as conceived by the right hemisphere, but is almost immediately represented by the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is the one of representation, and it's that enables us to be so clever at manipulating the world. What we need to do with our left hemisphere-driven grasping right hand when we grasp an idea or grasp something is we need to represent it. That's what language, after all, is a representation of life with labels for entities or existing things. And one rather nice little tidbit of information that helps one to see that is that when a signing deaf and dumb person has a stroke, you might think that because a lot of it is to do with gestural configuration, it might be at least as much to do with the right hemisphere as it is to do with the left. But in fact, if they have a stroke in Broca's and Wernicke's areas, that will stop them from signing. So it's not actually about language itself, or even about speech. It's certainly not about speech, but it's not about language, really. It's about attaching a symbol to something. And that explains why gorillas and chimpanzees have that bump in the left hemisphere, because they're the first creatures that begin to have conceptual thought of any kind. And the next step on from that is language. There are reasons, structural reasons, to do with the larynx and the control of the diaphragm and chest and so on, which explain why they don't talk, but that's a separate thing. So there we are. It's about representation. The world becomes represented as though the blood has been drained from it and we have a virtual copy of it. Now, that is actually terribly useful. You imagine a general fighting a battle. He can't fight the battle by going out and talking to all the soldiers on the ground and inspecting everything and having a good idea of all the plants that are growing and so on. He's got to have a very, very simple, schematic, abstracted view, which is a representation of what's going on. And that is the map on the wall with the little flags on it. And that is really what the left hemisphere offers us, a simplified but useful version of the world, where the right hemisphere gives us a very complex, rich, a living experience of the world, not a version of the world, which is unfortunately not going to make us powerful. It may make us wise, but it won't enable us to manipulate, because for that we need to have precision and control and limitation. And there is a sort of interesting philosophical correspondence to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. I'm sorry to any physicists in the audience to drag in physics, because I'm a total ignoramus really on all this. But Heisenberg's sort of thing that you can't specify the position and the momentum, the speed or momentum, yes, of the particle at the same time. Has a sort of correlate in philosophy which Hegel first spotted, that the more certain you make something, the less content it has. And there is an inverse relationship between precision and content. It's quite interesting. So we need both kinds of knowledge, all right? Now, I'm going to skip... have I got 10 minutes?
Yes, and then you still have a little bit of time.
Fine, okay. So I'm going to sort of can it there for the first half of the book, which has the sort of neuro stuff and the philosophy, and move on to the second half of the book, which is about the evolution of Western culture. And I can only do this very, very quickly. And of course, the book itself can only do it rather quickly, so it's a bit of a nonsense, really, but there we are. So I start off in the ancient world and then move forward to look at the Renaissance and the Reformation, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and finally modernism and postmodernism and what's happened in our world. And it struck me that if Sass was right to have pointed out indirectly that in illuminating that the modern world is rather like the schizophrenic's mind, and my making the link that that's actually rather like the left hemisphere's take on the world, maybe at other times, other parts of the hemispheres have sort of come in this sort of reciprocal sort of way. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I hope my thinking about it isn't too facile. It may come across a bit like that, but I hope it's a little bit better in the book. But effectively, if I can summarize, what I thought I saw was that in the ancient world, suddenly in around the 6th century BC, the coming forward of a balance between the right and the left hemispheres' ways of looking at the world. And there's another interesting book to recommend called Faces by a man called Milton Brenner, a very interesting chap in America, can't go off onto that, who anyway, wrote a book called Faces, which is about the evolution of the human face and the representation of the human face through the history of Western culture. And he referred to the research of a German called Hufschmidt, who had looked at 50,000 representations of the human face. And what he'd found was that until about the 6th century BC, most faces either looked straight ahead and were totally impassive and expressionless, or tended to look to the viewer's right, thus being preferentially, to the viewer's left, thus being the viewer's left. And therefore being taken in by the right visual field and the left hemisphere. But that around the 6th century BC, suddenly the majority of portraits started to face the other way, so that they were in the left visual field, which is the right hemisphere's preferred realm. And that was a sort of interesting sort of observation, which just happens to be factually true, but it also coincides with a paper in Nature by Nick Humphrey et al. In the 1970s, where they looked at Renaissance painting and found that the same thing happened in the Renaissance. So that sort of set me thinking about hemispheres a bit. And Brenner made the point that he thought that the Greek world was an efflorescence of the right hemisphere, because first of all people started to see individuals and they started to empathize with them, and their sculpture and their poetry shows a new awareness of the interiority of mind and of other people, and a flowering of metaphor, and all these sort of things. And that, of course, is true, but it's only part of the story. The Greek world also was the first to systematize abstract thinking, to set rigid sets of laws, and so on. So there is an intriguing distinction there. And people often think that science must be something very left hemisphere, like mathematics, but this is not the case at all. Mathematics turns out to be much more subserved by the right hemisphere. And indeed, I would make a distinction between empirical science, which is looking at what is, and is therefore a very right hemisphere thing, and the business of system formation and the setting of rules, which is much more of a left hemisphere aspect to science. And it's interesting that the pre-Socratic philosophers, who I think, had perceptions that got lost in Western thought until really the time of Schopenhauer and then Nietzsche, and in our century Heidegger and so forth, that opposites can cohere, and many other sort of important perceptions of the connectedness of things that are now considered irrational, or were until recently considered just irrational. They were also very good scientists. Thales made the first observations of an eclipse and was able to predict an eclipse correctly from his observation of the heavens. But as Greek thought goes on, it becomes more abstract, and the left hemisphere aspect of things comes to dominate. And I would say this sort of wonderful distance from the world, which was empathic, which is of course the founding of tragedy, Greek tragedy, perhaps their greatest creation, and the one that has most resonance with most people nowadays. I mean, that is, after all, about taking a step back from ourselves so that we can really connect with ourselves in that empathic way. And so at the greatest, there was a sort of pulling of both these right and left hemispheres to their maximum. But then as time wore on, the left hemisphere seems to have taken over. And by the time of Plato, you find him saying that to do astronomy, we should not be looking at the visible heavens, but inspecting some ideas we've got inside ourselves, which seems putting the cart before the horse as far as I'm concerned. And I then look at the Roman world. We haven't got time to talk about that, but it follows a similar path, really, with a sort of wonderful efflorescence in the Augustan age of the moral sense of an empathic sense of individuals, harmony of society, great flowering of all the great poets, Virgil, Catullus, Horace, Ovid. They were all about that same period. And then there's a decline, and you can see the sculpture, very beautifully observed faces, expressive faces. And by the 4th century, 3rd, 4th century AD, all of this has been lost. Rigid hierarchical projections of faces that have no character at all, and buildings that instead of having beautiful harmonious proportions are to do with power, blocks of concrete. There's something poetic about the fact that the Roman Empire was founded on the invention of concrete, and straight lines ruling, rigid grids ruling everything. The same cities being literally created everywhere in the empire. So, and then we come on to the Renaissance, and you can see what's coming, which is that in the Renaissance again, after 1,000 years, there seems to have been a wonderful, sudden, and incredibly rich coming forward of everything on the left, from the best contributions of the left and the right hemispheres working together. So you get art that's enriched by optics, and science that is enriched by observation and by spiritual knowledge. You have these things growing together wonderfully, and then and you see it in the philosophers, some of them of the time. I'm a great believer that Bacon is a maligned man, and Pascal, of course, a wonderful philosopher. Then you get the era of Descartes. I mean, Descartes maligned as well, but I mean, there is a lot in Descartes which nonetheless, unfortunately, does lead us down the garden path of the separation of mind and body, and indeed some of the things that he describes, some of his experiences, are rather like those of a schizophrenic. So the famous passage in which he's sitting in a window and he looks out of the window and he sees people walking about in the street, and he says, why should I believe these are people? They could be machines just walking about with their coats and hats on. That is exactly the experience. Actually, I've had schizophrenic patients. I've had one actually in the last 2 months who had to come into hospital, who was saying he was very disturbed by the fact that people seemed like machines wearing coats and hats. This is the ultimate thing that happens when you disengage completely from life and be, as Descartes said, a spectator in life, no longer engaged in any sense. Yes.
You've got just 10 minutes left.
I need less than 10. I need less than 10.
I mean 10 minutes for questions.
Oh, okay, well, I can finish then. We've only got 10 minutes for questions. I thought it went on till 1:45 or something. No, sorry. Okay, right, we're going to finish. That was really, oh God, that hasn't come out at all. That's that's from the Enlightenment. That's the French Revolution, actually. There's a lot to say about that picture, which I unpack a bit in the book, but it is rather wonderful about the separation of the head from the body. Interesting, Descartes himself was buried, his head was severed from his body, and they were buried in 2 separate places, which is, I always think God has a sense of humour. Because he did this, they always say never repeat a joke, but actually he did repeat it with Jeremy Bentham, who's another Enlightenment philosopher, who had his body pickled so that it could be an icon, an auto-icon, he called it. It's in is it University College Hospital in London. Talk about the representation of the human being, the person having become their own icon. But anyway, the head then got terribly shrunken and shriveled, so it's replaced with a wax head from which it's periodically been stolen. So this is really just to show, because one of my heroes is Blake, and we haven't got time to talk about Romanticism and how the right hemisphere happens to make a comeback for a short while. But what's nice about this picture, just for me, forget the Y-fronts which were painted on by the Victorians, but to disguise actually a pretty good erection here, because he was actually very excited by this spiritual experience, which was of inspiration when the soul of Milton entered his body through his left tarsus. He says quite specifically, he draws it and he says it in the poem, on my left tarsus, which actually relates to a point in the right hemisphere, very close down in the interhemispheric fissure near the limbic system, and also the sexual area, which is probably why he's sexually excited. And that was really just to show what happens to perspective in the modern era when we don't relate. This is really, forget it. Okay.
Well, that was absolutely extraordinary to be able to cover that amount of detail. All right. I don't know. Modern technology. Is it on? Yeah. To be able to cover that amount of detail in that time is absolutely amazing. I'd like to quote just one line from a poem, and I'm sure it's one that Iain will recognise. It's by Robert Browning, and it comes from the Toccata of Galuppi. And the poet is listening to somebody playing the toccata on the piano, and he says, "I can always sit and listen when I hear a master play." And that line came to me very, very strongly listening to Iain. I would describe Iain as a genius in this area, and I don't think many people here would disagree with me. Well, we've got some minutes for questions, so I'm not going to take them up with nonsense. So let's try to be very, very specific and keep very, very much to a short question. Stuart.
Very brief question. And I'm sorry, after such a masterly talk, this is a very inarticulate question. Thank you. You haven't, I think, alluded to the sort of explosion that has happened in the last 10 or so years, thanks to brain imaging, and no doubt we'll hear more from Peter Fenwick on this, and the coming together of what has been learnt from brain imaging and psychoanalytic concepts and predictions, which at first, like many people, I welcomed this as wonderfully exciting stuff. Now I've got a different take on it, and I'd like yours, which is, now we really do know everything. Well, of course, that's a bit difficult, because medics always did know everything. I knew when I was in medical school that I knew everything, because you've dissected the brain. But it's this feeling that instead of terra incognita, now we know everything, the Alan Shaw stuff.
Well, I don't think we do know everything at all. I mean, that's a typical left hemisphere. I mean, I know you're not putting it forward as you're regretting it, but it's a very left hemisphere point of view. I mean, I think the most wise people would say the more we know, the more we realise how far we have to go. And I hadn't got time to go into really anything very much in the book, actually, but I mean, certainly didn't have time to talk about the sort of sources of the information. One of them, of course, is neuroimaging. But I've got about 4 or 5 pages in the book where I just go through about 8 heffalump traps that are associated with neuroimaging, and believing that because this bit lights up, that's the bit that's whatever. And so I've only ever based things on more than imaging, so it's got to be congruent with the findings from lesion studies and from hemisphere dissociation studies. And I'm interested in Alan Shaw's work, of course, who I refer to in the book, and that is in a way a sort of coming together in the way that Freud rather hoped of the psychoanalytic and the neurological. But I don't. I would utterly resist the idea that we know everything. In fact, the whole thesis of my book is that we're knowing less and less because we stress information more and more, and know less and less, and are wise ultimately not at all. I mean, what I didn't have time to talk about was the modern society thing, which is what this whole book culminates in, actually, which is a discussion of where we are now, which I believe is in a sort of virtual world, a decontextualized world, a fragmented world, in which all the connections have been broken and the thing appears to have no meaning.
Yes, thank you for that. I was fascinated by your view of the broad sweep of cultures rising and falling, and I think there's a great deal of insight there. But I just want to push you in a slightly different angle. At the very beginning, you made what seemed almost a throwaway line about ontology, and I'm wondering where that becomes fleshed out a little more. And let me push you, when you were talking about language and thought, and you made comments about the cyclical nature, and in a sense we're co-creators and creating the world through thought. Is there an ontological aspect of that? in what sense are we creating the world?
Well, it's a big question, a good question. I think it comes back to my point about our relationship with whatever it is, which we might call our attention, our disposition to it. I think lots of things which describe our relationship to the world, like knowing and believing and so on, are misunderstood. I mean, one of the problems at the moment is belief is thought of as a kind of weak form of knowledge. Belief is not a kind of knowledge, it's certainly not a certainty. It's a disposition towards things as if certain things were true. And which is not to say that they're not, but because the right hemisphere can't be certain of anything, it brings that thing into being by its relationship with it. I don't know where to go. I mean, in brief, I think there's a sort of version of Pascal's wager. I also used to think Pascal's wager was a bit silly, really, but in fact there's something very profound in it. I mean, there are really only three possibilities about God, really. Either God exists anyway out there and is something that we need to get to know, in which case we should dispose ourselves to do so. Or God is, or the divine or the spiritual is a realm which we help to bring about and are involved in the process. And in fact, our whole creation comes out of it and goes back into it and is a product of it and a stimulant for the further growth of it. If that is the case, then our disposition towards it is extremely important again. And the third is that there is no God, in which case one loses nothing by having the disposition towards the world as if there was, except that the atheist will say, well, but the thing is, it's just not true. But then I would say, but then where do you get the idea of privileging truth from? In a world where there is nothing spiritual, why is it better to be true than to be, say, happy? And the answer to that takes you back, as Kant always thought. I mean, the thing I like about Kant was that he didn't think that he believed in God because of moral values. He believed in moral values because of a God. He believed in God because there are moral values. Yeah.
Right. I'm sorry, but I have to make that the last question. And I've just finished by thanking Iain again and saying that after listening to that masterful explanation, I don't think any of us, and this is certainly true of Iain's book, will think ever quite the same way about our own brain. And he's given us, in fact, a way of re-examining our own behaviour, why we do things, and being, in a sense, more in control, so that we can decide perhaps not to spend all our time with the emissary and go back to the master, as indeed you are mastering.
Oh, David, thank you. Thank you very much.